In October of 1989, 24-year-old Tracey Wigginton committed one of the most heinous murders in Australian history. Investigators initially assumed that the killer was a man. After all, everyone thought women were incapable of committing such brutal crimes. However, the case made headlines around the world because Tracey and her three accomplices were young lesbians. The story became even more sensationalized during the trial when it was revealed that Tracey had calmly smoked a cigarette and drank her victim's blood after nearly severing his head. Ever since, she's been known as Australia's Lesbian Vampire Killer. The story that's about to be described contains some graphic descriptions and may not be suitable for younger audiences. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Tracey Avril Wigginton was born in Queensland, Australia on August 4th, 1965. She grew up in Rockhampton City, but was adopted by her maternal grandparents when she was 3 years old because her mother had health problems and couldn't support her after divorcing Tracey's father. Tracey claimed that her grandparents were controlling and overbearing, and worse yet, they physically, emotionally, and abused her. Even so, they both died in the early 80s and left Tracey a large inheritance. However, the will stipulated that she couldn't touch the money until her 21st birthday. After their deaths, she moved back in with her mother, but the reunion was short-lived. Even after such a long separation, she just couldn't accept that her daughter was a lesbian. They ultimately reconciled years later, but on more than one occasion, Tracey told friends that someday she'd make her mother pay for her horrible childhood. Unfortunately, her horrible childhood wasn't behind her. At 16, she was impregnated by an older married man that she'd met through her mother. He convinced Tracey to have an abortion and to keep his identity secret so he wouldn't be prosecuted for statutory rape and lose his job, home, and family. Tracey agreed, but he ultimately cut off all communication and support. She got a job as a bartender and occasionally worked as a prostitute to make extra cash. She also began cutting her hair short, dressing like a man, and referring to herself as Bobby. Later, she met and unofficially married a woman named Sunshine in a Hare Krishna-style wedding ceremony in Cairns. The two were inseparable, but Tracey continued working as a prostitute to make ends meet. She wasn't interested in men sexually, but she and Sunshine sought out a sperm donor after deciding they wanted to raise a child together. They initially considered artificial insemination, but Tracey decided to have intercourse with the donor while Sunshine and a number of other witnesses were in the room. The strange ritual resulted in a pregnancy, but Tracey had a miscarriage a few months later. Losing the baby crushed Tracey and Sunshine and put tremendous strain on their already rocky relationship. To cope, they turned to drugs, alcohol, and strangely, witchcraft and vampirism. They spent most of their time partying and watching slasher movies, and Tracey often sat for hours doodling airy figures with human and animal characteristics. Sometimes, she used her own blood as ink. By then, Tracey was old enough to collect her inheritance, but she and Sunshine spent most of it on a number of lengthy overseas holidays. And when the money was gone, Sunshine left Tracey for a man she'd been seeing on the side. This betrayal sent Tracey into an emotional tailspin. However, she eventually moved to Brisbane, found a new lover, assumed another male alter ego, and dove even deeper into astrology, satanism, and vampirism. By the late 80s, she was an imposing 6-foot, 95-kilo factory worker with a dark, charismatic personality and a notoriously short temper. She was also the leader of a small cult of budding vampires and Satan worshippers, composed exclusively of young lesbians. In addition to Tracey, the other three members were known as Kim Jervis, Tracy Waugh, and Lisa Pachynski. Kim Jervis and Tracy Waugh were 23-year-old lovers who were desperately looking for a place to fit in when they met Tracey Wigginton. As a child, Kim collected dolls and even considered becoming a nun. Tracy Waugh also grew up in a traditional Catholic home, but her shy, self-conscious and naive personality made her particularly susceptible to Tracey Wigginton's manipulations. The last member was Tracey's girlfriend, Lisa Pachynski, who'd been hospitalized dozens of times for drug overdoses and an addiction to self. As the group's undisputed leader, Tracey often purchased animal blood from local butchers that they consumed during rituals. However, she preferred human blood because, according to her, it was far tastier and more nutritious. Once, when Lisa owed Tracey money, she repaid the debt by letting Tracey drink her blood. Since Lisa regularly killed herself anyway, the macabre arrangement worked well for both parties. On the night, Friday, 20th of October 1989, Tracey Wigginton, Lisa Pachynski, Tracy Waugh, and Kim Jervis spent hours drinking at a lesbian nightclub in Fortitude Valley. By then, Tracey and Lisa had been together for a few weeks, but Tracey still lived with another woman who she suspected of cheating. Despite having another lover herself, Tracey had become increasingly angry with the betrayal. In fact, the pressure had been building all day, and the alcohol and drugs coursing through her system were making the already tense situation even worse. Tracey needed a way to blow off the excess steam, and according to some accounts, she was also on the hunt for a large dose of human blood to nourish her weakened body. With a little luck, she hoped she'd be able to kill two birds with one stone. Across town in Kangaroo Point, a slim, balding 47-year-old council worker named Edward Baldock was drinking and playing darts with friends. Just before midnight, when the alcohol caught up with Edward, he stumbled outside to find a taxi to take him home. Just then, a green Holden Commodore, driving down O'Connell Street, pulled up beside him. As the car came to a stop, Edward steadied himself on a lamppost and squinted to see if he recognised the occupants. Inside, Tracey Wigginton, Lisa Pachynski, Tracy Waugh, and Kim Jervis looked up at him. When Tracey saw Edward, she immediately knew, as she later put it, that he was the one. When Lisa stopped the car, Tracey rolled down the window, offered Edward a ride, and insinuated that she and the other young women might be interested in sex as well. Edward smiled and got back in the seat, but after some friendly banter, he promptly fell asleep and began snoring. Tracey ordered Lisa to drive to Orley Park on the Brisbane River, just a few miles away. Tracey was the only one who spoke on the short drive, but the tension was palpable, because everyone sensed that something terrible was about to happen. When they arrived at the river, Lisa parked the car and Tracey woke Edward up. Then, they led him down to a clearing by the water's edge, where Tracey said she'd forgot something back at the car. As she walked away, Lisa told Edward to take off his clothes so he'd be ready when Tracey got back. At the car, Kim Jervis handed Tracey a butterfly knife she carried for protection. Kim Jervis and Tracy Waugh stayed in the car as Tracey Wigginton walked back down to the river. Edward was facing away from her as she approached. She also noticed that he was naked except for a pair of white socks and that his clothes were folded on the ground beside him. Lisa said something to Edward as Tracey removed the knife from her pocket, but by this time, he'd sobered up and realised that he wasn't about to have a steamy romp with a much younger woman. When Tracey was just an arm's length away, he turned his head and asked what she was doing, and at that moment, she plunged the knife into his back. Edward tried to grab her to prevent her from inflicting another wound, but she brought the knife up and stabbed him in the neck. Then she grabbed his hair, yanked his head back, and stabbed him in the throat. It's impossible to say how long the attack lasted, but it was probably over in a matter of seconds. Whatever the case, Tracey stabbed Edward Baldock nearly 30 times in the neck, back, and torso. The damage was so horrific that his head was barely attached to his neck. Edward fell to the ground with a sickening thud, and as he lay dying, the gaping wounds in his chest and throat emitted eerie gurgling sounds. Lisa witnessed the attack from just a few meters away. Later, she described it as merciless and surreal. She also said that Tracey was in a trance, like a shark in a feeding frenzy. When it was all over, Lisa walked back to the car. Alone with her victim, Tracey smoked a cigarette, drank some of Edward's blood, and washed herself and the knife off in the river. Then she walked back to the car and led Lisa and Kim back down to the river to see her handiwork. Tracy Waugh was too petrified and distraught to join them. On the drive home, the unmistakable scent of blood hung thick in the air. At the trial, Tracy Waugh testified that the smell was coming from Tracey Wigginton's breath. It was nearly 3 a.m. by the time Lisa dropped Tracey off at her flat. Her flatmate knew something was wrong the minute she saw her. Tracey assured her that everything was okay, then took a shower and put on clean clothes. But before turning in, she discovered that her Commonwealth bank card was missing. Before the sun came up, she drove back to Orley Park to see if she could find it. But Tracey couldn't find the card. She had little choice but to go back home and hope for the best. That said, she knew it was only a matter of time before someone found Edward's body. And later that morning, it was discovered by a jogger who immediately called the police. Officers responded quickly, cordoned off the crime scene, and found Tracey's bank card in the toe of one of Edward's shoes. They also found his wallet on the grounds of a nearby sailing club. Unsurprisingly, officers showed up at Tracey's flat a few hours later. She admitted to being at the river with the friends the previous night. However, she told them that she didn't know anything about a murder and that she couldn't figure out how her bank card ended up in the dead man's shoe. Though it must have seemed like an unbelievable coincidence, Tracey must have been remarkably cool and convincing because the officers initially believed her. In the beginning, they just couldn't believe that a woman would have committed such a violent murder. Tracey was eventually questioned again, and the second time around, she told investigators that she had seen Edward's body at the river that night, but that she'd panicked and fled instead of calling 000. By now, investigators were convinced that Tracey was directly involved in Edward's murder, and by the end of the day, everyone who had been there that night was in custody. A few days later, they were all charged with murder. Before the trial, Tracey was evaluated by a court-appointed psychiatrist who diagnosed her with dissociative identity disorder. More commonly known as multiple personality disorder, it was Tracey's way of coping with her traumatic childhood. Nonetheless, she was deemed mentally fit to stand trial. She pleaded guilty, but Tracey Waugh, Kim Jervis, and Lisa Pachinski all entered not guilty pleas, and the proceedings got underway in Queensland Supreme Court the following February. During the sensational 2-week trial, there were moments when Tracey seemed to relish her newfound stardom, but in general, she and Lisa came across as aloof, emotionless, and disinterested. Even so, her defense attorneys repeatedly pointed out what she'd been through as a child and tried to downplay her vampirism and fascination with the occult. However, the jury only deliberated for 48 hours before returning with guilty verdicts for Tracey and Lisa. Kim Jervis was convicted of manslaughter, and Tracey Waugh was acquitted because she played no active role in the murder and stayed in the car when the others went to see Edward's body. Later, the judge sentenced Tracey and Lisa to life in prison, which is generally about 20 years in Queensland. Kim Jervis got 18 years, but her sentence was reduced by a third after a successful appeal. Tracey Wigginton did her time in Brisbane Women's Prison, where one former inmate said she wasn't like anyone else. Sometimes she sat for longer periods of time staring into space, but she often intimidated those around her by scowling and grinding her teeth. Even so, most of Tracey's time on the inside was relatively uneventful, and in 2003 she was transferred to a minimum security prison farm. She assaulted a guard and another inmate a few years later, but after 4 unsuccessful parole applications, she was finally released on January the 11th, 2012, after more than 2 decades behind bars. Now 46 years old, Tracey was far heavier and less mobile when she hobbled out of Numbinbard Correctional Centre on crutches. Tracey lived in a halfway house and flew under the radar until 2019, when she posted a collection of macabre images on Facebook and stated that it was time to panic because, as she put it, she was back. In 1996, while she was still in prison, Tracey told a journalist from the Courier Mail that she was in a blind fury when she stabbed Edward Baldock to death all the way back in 1989. She also said that killing another human being was a terrifying experience and that nobody should have the power over life and death. Tracey's mother struggled to come to terms with her daughter's troubled life and the appalling crimes she committed, and despite the evidence to the contrary, she refused to believe that her daughter was a vampire or that she had more than one personality. She once told a reporter that Tracey couldn't stand the sight of blood as a child, but neither she nor anyone else ever figured out how Tracey's bank card ended up in Edward's shoe. One theory is that one of her alter egos took over during the murder and put it there without her knowledge. Whatever the case, to her mother, Tracy will always be the beautiful, caring, and fun-loving kid with a knack for making everyone laugh. On the other hand, Edward Baldock's daughter was appalled that Tracy ever got out of prison. To her, she'll always be the remorseless vampire who murdered her father in cold blood. This has been another episode in our second annual Halloween special here on Shadow Matter, the case of Tracey Wigginton, Australia's lesbian vampire killer. What do you think of the mask? What do you think of the setup? Tell me what you think in the comments below. And if you want to see one of your comments right here, then start a comment with Shadow Shoutout. And if you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, hit subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and click that notifications bell to keep up to date with the latest videos. And together, we can explore the strange, the terrifying, the unknown, the Shadow Matter.